Imagine if Labour had a leader whose family friend was part of the QAnon cult, categorised by the FBI as a domestic terror threat in the United States. And imagine if that family friend's wife was employed by taxpayers to chaperone a Labour Prime Minister's wife. Imagine if a Labour Prime Minister was one of only a handful of world leaders who openly supported Donald Trump, the worst US president in history. And if that same Labour Prime Minister never denounced the insurrection and attack on American democracy in Washington DC on the 6th of January 2021. Imagine if Labour ministers were part of a cover-up of an alleged rape perpetrated by one of their senior staffers in Parliament House, and if that alleged rapist was still at large. Imagine if Labour was in government and their Attorney General was accused of brutally raping a young woman when he was 17, and then sued the national broadcaster for defamation over their reporting of it. Imagine if Labour had to pay $1.2 billion of your money in compensation for a disastrous policy as cruel as it was costly. The untold suffering of the robo-debt scheme will never be fully known, but so far not one Morrison government minister has been held accountable for up to 2,000 deaths, including an unknown number of suicides, to which the horror of robo-debt contributed. Do you think a Labour government would get away with that? Imagine if Labour had spent $7.75 million of taxpayer money developing an app that was supposed to be the answer to restricting the spread of COVID. Imagine if they'd spent an additional $60 million to advertise it and a further $7,500 per month to run it. Then imagine if that app had traced just 17 contacts, last time we checked, not already found by contact tracing teams around the country. Imagine if that same app had been rendered redundant by the humble state-run QR code systems. Imagine how the media would react once they did the COVID Safe app maths for a Labour government. Imagine if a Labour treasurer had miscalculated an income subsidy for millions of Australians during a pandemic to the tune of $60 billion. And then refused to spend that $60 billion on income support for university workers, the arts, casuals, and other groups who'd been excluded from earlier support because a line had to be drawn somewhere. Imagine if a Labour Prime Minister and Health Minister had promised that Australia would be at the front of the queue for COVID vaccines a year before any vaccines materialised. Imagine if it turned out that same Prime Minister and Health Minister had not only lied about Australia being at the front of the queue, they then failed in rolling out the COVID vaccine to our most vulnerable people. At the time of recording, Australia ranked 105th in the world when it came to the share of the population who had received at least one vaccine dose. Imagine if their vaccine messaging had been so poor and so conflicted that about 1/3 of Australians said they were unlikely to get vaccinated at all. Imagine if a Labour government had abandoned tens of thousands of its citizens overseas during a global pandemic, putting them at very real risk of financial hardship, homelessness, mental anguish, sickness, and even death. Imagine if a Labour government had threatened Australian citizens with jail if they dared to return home from a COVID hotspot like India. And that decision led to Australians dying from COVID while stranded there. Imagine if a Labour government had passed the buck to the states for quarantining incoming travellers during a global pandemic, when quarantine is a federal responsibility. Hotels are meant for tourism, not quarantine. We have lived through more than a year of COVID. The Morrison government has had more than a year to build fit-for-purpose facilities for quarantine so that stranded Aussies could return home. They have had more than a year to remove the risk of community COVID spread from hotel quarantine leaks that result in lockdowns and enormous economic and social damage. Do you think the media would have given a Labour government a free pass on their constitutional quarantine responsibility, as they have done for the Morrison government? Imagine if a Labour Prime Minister had gone on a family holiday to Hawaii when much of the country was burning. Imagine if a Labour government had spent over $6 million on keeping an innocent family locked up in detention and denied a small child the urgent medical attention she needed. How would you feel if a Labour government provided us with enough instances of corruption, incompetence, avoidance of accountability, misleading of Parliament and lack of care for its citizens that this video would need to be feature film length to document them all? If you would feel outraged and betrayed, then you should be demanding an end to the Morrison government. Fact: the media is failing Australia by not holding this corrupt shambles of a government to account. Fact: Australia cannot afford another term under the Morrison regime. Vote them out, for all our sakes.